that anyone has is the experience they expect everywhere.
Yeah. So that actually takes me into my sort of next piece of this that I want to talk about. And you alluded to it. And I'm going to share my screen in a second. But I want to get into this idea, and I think Jan, you alluded to it, right? What you were doing was you were sort of collaborating, co-creating with your potential customers. And so one of the things that's sort of this process, and some of one of the takeaways I want to give to the audience is I want to share this sort of 5-step process that Nicholas and I have sort of I sort of started, and Nicholas helped me perfect, so to speak. And I think it's very relevant to sort of the discussion especially for entrepreneurs and others. And so, and then what, Nicholas, I want to do is I want to, get you to sort of deep dive into some of this. So of course you've seen this chart before. I've cleaned it up a little. I've changed a little bit, but I want to start with the concept of the double diamond, right? And I want you to get your perspective on this sort of diverge, converge, diverge. This is something I've actually started using because I think you probably showed it to me. And then we'll go into these sort of 5 steps after that. Is that making sense?
Yeah. I think, what is it? Pivotal. Comes out of the double diamond, right? That comes out of the pivotal.
I don't know where it came from. I just took it from somebody, maybe you, and have sort of enhanced it and used it in my my work.
Yeah, and you'll see this model, kind of tweaked for across the industry. I think like IDEO has a flavor of this. IBM has its infinite loop flavor of this, and I think when I look at this, right, it's really helpful when you're dealing with a very diverse and empowered team, right? Where you have a lot of strong opinions and a lot of strong expertise. How do you get as much out of that group that you're working with in the time by letting them diverge and work independently? And then when you're converging, right, you're bringing that back together, and that's about prioritization. And so as you kind of move through this kind of this process, right, you're continuously working together, separating, and then coming back together. And it ultimately allows you to kind of grok where you're at in the process and perhaps what might be a good next step, and these steps, I would say, are not linear, right? I think they're represented linearly, but you can get dropped in at any point of this diamond and start there. So you could start with a prototype, put it in front of your user base, just like Jan did, right? He's like, we weren't sure if this service was going to work. So we made something, we put it out there. We're going to make to learn. We're going to put this artifact in the world. We're going to provoke a group of people to respond to it by this thing. And then we'll kind of land back on that observe and define stage. Now that we have a better understanding, there might be some interest. We're observing the people are responding. Now, how do we kind of refine that and define kind of what that offering might be? So what that could look like, a follow-up step to those 6 respondents is maybe let's set 6 conversations up, like 30-minute to an hour-long interview, and talk to them about what their unmet needs are around this. Perhaps that might expose kind of what their unmet needs are. Perhaps it might give you some other feature opportunities or additional requirements just by talking to them. Sometimes you can invite them to kind of say, show me how you might use this data. Like, what decisions are you making with the information that you're, how do I use this Facebook pixel data? What questions am I asking the data? And by learning that, now you can kind of further define the problem statement you actually want to solve for these customers. And even just the response is like, there's interest, right? But now I've got to really kind of dig down into that interest and figure out what's that pain point? Like, what's the why? Why are these people interested? What value does understanding the relationship between Facebook and Google Analytics and that kind of visibility, what value does that provide my business? And then by understanding that value that you're providing to those potential customers, now you can kind of shape that offering a little bit more thoughtfully to kind of reach that product market fit that John's describing.
And so what we ended up doing, and what I'm sort of want to work with me here a little bit, I'm going to sort of step through these 5 phases, if we would, that we sort of stumbled upon. Now, these are, as Nicholas said, you can start anywhere in sort of this loop. But what we as salespeople found is like the only way somebody buys something is if they have a problem they're trying to fix, right? So there's some pain or there's something they need, right? Otherwise, it's a nice to have, and there nobody's going to take the time, especially if you're selling something that is fairly expensive. So the idea is we started with sort of at the end with this idea of a problem. What's the problem the client? So my advice to entrepreneurs is, what is the problem that your product or service sells, right? Or is trying to solve, excuse me. You know, and then the first step is just what we said is, understanding your stakeholders or personas. So give me your perspective, Nicholas, on sort of how, you're the one that really got me in depth of understanding the value of personas as mapping personas.
Oh wow. So personas. So how would I say this? Not all personas that you'll encounter in the world are created with the same rigor. A lot, if the definition I use for a persona is it's a qualitative data model that captures what users' kind of key goals are, what their pain points are, what their behaviors are, and what their unmet needs are. And you can create those personas in a number of ways. Ideally, primary research is your primary method of data collection when you're collecting kind of the information that's going to inform that model. And you can use these qualitative data models or these personas in a number of ways. In the software space, we'll use it right when we're kicking off a new feature to figure out, who is the potential end user of this feature, what value do they expect from this feature, are we, when we go out to test, in this and prototype, are we recruiting the right people that are representative of the persona to make sure that we are testing the solution with the right group? We can use our personas to help anchor people in a user experience. So, for example, when you think about the behaviors of a developer, right? There are behaviors that are developed. There are developers that are developing in the cloud. There are developers that are developing locally, right? There are developers that are using a command line interface, and then there are developers that are using graphic user interface. So by having that segmentation across your different user group and having two kind of personas to represent those different behavioral characteristics, now you've got more experiences that can be created. What's the command line experience for Jim, the 50-year-old sysadmin who's been programming in a data center, who's working in a data center or in a NOC his entire life, and he just loves the command line, doesn't care about GUIs, versus like, Jane, who's like a 23-year-old developer, just wants to write app code, doesn't even want to open up the command line, wants all that stuff to be handled for her, and she just wants to click a few buttons to get an environment that she needs so she can code. You've got two kind of great opportunity spaces just by understanding that segmentation. Another place that I've seen personas be used in a really interesting way is when you start to think about ability, people with varying abilities. And you can think about that across a spectrum, right? There are people that are permanently living with a disability. For example, someone who, is doesn't live with the ability to see, versus somebody who is situationally unable to see because they just went to the doctor, right? And just got their eyes dilated. So when you think about those personas in the extreme and you come up with that experience for them by deeply understanding this person's ability, it opens up kind of the aperture of the types of experiences that you can use to differentiate, right? So by deeply understanding some of what we call the extreme users, you start to get at new spaces and new opportunities for product innovation as well. So you can use personas in a lot of different ways.
Excellent. Well, and one of the things is we take this over to the design or the sales side, is that we can getting a feedback. We
I think you might be getting it from the. Oh wow, I'm getting feedback too. Hold on
there
one
we
sec.
go. I think it was Nicholas going on mute helped.
We good there?
All right.
Cool, beautiful.
Yeah. All right. So, Nicholas, one of the things I was thinking is also what I've noticed in this world. Like, so you got a lot of great points, and now that we take that over into some like a seller or a founder trying to sell their product or service, And we see a lot of work done around buying personas. But what I didn't see was a lot of work on the people that are actually going to use the problem persona, if you will, the person that has the problem. And so that sort of takes me into step two, which is which is one of my favorites, is the empathy mapping. And I actually took Jan through an empathy mapping exercise early on in his journey. So, tell us about empathy mapping from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love to use empathy maps in a couple different ways. I think one of the best ways I've seen empathy maps employed is when you have a group of different stakeholders that perhaps are saying maybe, yes, this is our user, but perhaps they think about that user a little differently. So the first thing it does is it just gets all the assumptions about who you're serving on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a place to document them. It gives you an opportunity to spot the tension within the team. It also gives you an opportunity to reveal gaps in what you don't know about your user. And so you can use an empathy map as a way to kind of build your research hypothesis, and then also inform your research planning as you kind of deepen your understanding of your users. Another way I've seen. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, then at the end of the day, right, you're stepping in the shoes of your users or the people you're selling to, and you're trying to understand what they say, what they feel, what they do, and what they think.
Yeah, and we were really lucky because instead of us kind of proxying and imagining what these end users are saying, doing, thinking, and feeling, we actually would do this activity with the end user, where they would populate it themselves. They're like, this is what I do, this is what I do. So it removes all the speculation and conjecture. One of the keys of design thinking and enterprise design thinking is that our users align us with reality. And when you're kind of in the office and you're not getting out of the building and you're not talking to your end users, we get a lot of head trash, as I think John has used the word, which is a lot of assumptive thinking. A lot of energy gets invested in like negotiating with your teammates, as opposed to bringing some data to the conversation that is going to remove all that kind of conflict and immediately give everyone kind of a direction to go in. That's the other thing that, a lot of the value that you get from talking to your users is it prevents burnout, right? Like if you have a strong team with strong opinions and they're investing an hour to 3 hours to 4 hours a week negotiating how one thing should look, you're creating churn, right? You're not necessarily empowering those people to be as effective as possible, because instead of understanding their users and taking those 4 hours and talking to some customers, they're spending 4 hours arguing or debating or negotiating. So that's kind of a litmus test, actually, for those of you out there, that if you notice yourself in a meeting multiple times having the same conversation, that's probably a good opportunity to get out of the building and go talk to your end users and save your team some time.
Well, one of the things we learned was, Nicholas, put your mute on for a sec. Yeah. One of the things we learned was that when we got a group of people in the room, everybody knows something about the personas or the people that we're working on, but they learned a ton about each other, right? And they really were all of a sudden realizing, and this, I think COVID brought this out, people really started to empathize with the people they were working with. And they really started to realize how they sort of all were interconnected in essentially running the business, so to speak.
Which, to go back to what you were talking about, which is like, how does empathy become transformation, right? That's the catalyst, that empathy for one another, where you start to see how one action that someone you don't even talk to or is not in the same department as you, they take, and that impacts you downstream. A lot of times there's no visibility into how the choices that you're making impact other people within your organization. I've been in workshops where, the front of the house and the back of the house of this banking organization, they were so upset with each other because the back of the house needed this one piece of information and the front of the house continued to not provide it to them. So this back of the house employee was just trapped. And it didn't come out until they were in the same room that the back of the house and the front of the house people realized that the field that the back of the house person needed populated wasn't even in the front of the house person's interface. They didn't even know. And there was just like animosity between these two departments. And it was just this one field that just wasn't showing up in this one interface that was just like hamstringing an entire department. And that was nobody's fault. That was bad user experience, right? That's nobody's fault. But bringing these people together in the room, they're like, why? Oh, you're so frustrated. They wouldn't even talk to each other at the beginning of the session. There was so much tension. And then as they started to understand what the data that matters, one of the people in the front of the house clicked and they're like, oh, wait, this sounds like this is really critical to like you all being able to do these parts. And like one of my reasons that I'm frustrated with you all is because it takes so long to get this task accomplished. But what I'm hearing you say is we're not actually getting you the information you need. And the person was like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, that's interesting because our interface actually doesn't even ask for that information. So I didn't even know that you needed it. And they both looked at each other and like, I swear they wanted to hug, like, cause they were like, oh my goodness, like we've had all this tension, like, and now we realize that like this is a technology problem, not a people problem. But it wouldn't have happened until they kind of deep dived into one another's empathy maps and deep dived into what each other were doing. And even like kind of a little bit more important, like what's the data that matters to each of these different people? And how do we make sure that that information is exchanged in the way that everybody needs to find it?
Did I jump in?
Yeah.
All right. So I've been like super, super obsessed recently with the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and why they're separated by the corpus callosum, right? So for those of you that like, I'm going to get a little bit anatomy here to just kind of set the stage. But so we have this thing called the corpus callosum or corpus callosum running through the right and left hemispheres of our brain. And it's basically its entire job is to prevent electrical signals from crossing over, right? Because if they start to do that and everything starts to spark all at once, it's called epilepsy, right? Like your brain is having a seizure, everything's, connected all at one time and it just provides information overload. But what you're describing, what I think is really cool about as you guys are walking through this process and we're talking about empathy to transformation, right? There's actually a lot of like neurochemical triggers that you guys are triggering in people that will bond them to make future innovation possible. Because like you said, at the end of that, like I swear to God, they wanted to hug, right? In that moment, they're getting such a large rush of serotonin and oxytocin and dopamine, right? That they're just in this place where they now feel bonded to this person, right? So they're now in the future are going to communicate. You've not only identified a problem, you've destroyed a communication barrier, which I think is, that's really part of where the real value comes in. So what's fascinating about the way that you guys, this double diamond approach is in the left part of our brain, we really anchor things down, right? Like a good example is like for most people, they're right-handed. So the left part of your brain guides the right hand, and that's like you're grasping, right? So you're picking things up. That's a tangible idea. That's something that you have a hold of. Whereas the right brain kind of has this, its job is to perceive everything else. Like I'm talking to you guys right now, so I'm very focused on this conversation. That's my left brain kind of guiding my perception here. But my right brain is telling me that I know that, there's other things going on in my apartment. If I heard a door click, I would turn, right? But that's not the immediate part of my perception. But the way that the diamond forces you to go is that it forces people into that right brain thought where it's like, okay, what are all of the other possibilities of things that could potentially be causing this to be disrupted? And let's take it and then narrow it down into something where we can actually grasp something. And then, like you said, that light bulb moment happens, but it only happens when you get into a right brain space where the right brain is really good at pattern recognition. And it'll recognize a pattern. And then as the conversation continues, that pattern will start to get more refined. Things will start to happen. And then somewhere along that continuum, there's a ding, right? And then it transitions over into this left brain thought process that now fills in all the details and understands the process and can actually tangibly grasp something like that problem, right? But that wouldn't happen if you didn't get those two people into the room at the same time and create that conversation or that space. I always talk about creating creative space to allow people to have those conversations. So like doing that, I'm just like fascinated with all of the actual biological triggers that you guys are hitting throughout this process. That's what I've been really focused on learning a lot about recently. So I just had to throw that in there for all of my RNs and science people that listen to the Apex.
That's the ICU nurse coming out of you. So,
Yeah.
so we've done this sort of first two first two pieces where we've, we started with a sort of specific set and identified sort of a problem, and or we then started diverging, understanding who's involved and who was impacted by those problems, and then we continue to diverge by trying to actually empathize with them. The next sort of phase of this is to start to converge, which is really to start to identify so now that we've walked in the shoes of those personas, we now can sort of identify where the opportunity is for improvement. So it's sort of like, how do I transform them, or how do I help them navigate these seas of these disruptive seas? And then we'll, the next sort of 3 and 4 sort of go together. Once we diverge into like where the opportunities are, then we converge out and try to figure out where our product and solution will help them solve those, or fix or address those opportunities. So sort of, I want to sort of, Nicholas, give us, your perspective on sort of that next phase, right? Once we've worked and we sort of lived the world, we start to now try to, from a sales perspective, I'm now trying to identify things that the unmet needs of the client or the prospect with my product or service.
Well, I think it's great. I think, it's always good to design with the end in mind, right? And I think in the context of some of the work that John and I were doing is like, we knew we needed a phased approach. We knew we needed to be able to deliver value within 90 days. Like, that was what we were looking for, is like, where do we start? We've got all these opportunities now. We've bubbled these all up. We have some hypotheses on where to start based on what we, working, in this context many times. But now, we're seeing if the customer is going to arrive at some of the same conclusions that we've kind of are already hypothesizing about. So if the goal is to kind of get to this 90-day or proof of value or minimum viable product, and you've gone through the activity of understanding the empathy map and where those pain points are, now you need to get some prioritization, right? So once you kind of have articulated some of the pain points, we'd work with our customers to kind of articulate value propositions or user-centered statements of intent with a measurable outcome that's compelling and differentiating. We call them hills in enterprise design thinking. And we have those participants of these workshops actually articulate what value and success looks like to them in their own words. So we'll go through this activity where they'll craft as many kind of value statements to this particular user as possible. And then we prioritize it, right? And we prioritize it by impact to that end user and feasibility of the solution, meaning is what do we have on the truck aligned with what the customer's seeking in that priority. And so the feasibility of us being able to deliver it and the prioritization of that value by the customer helps find kind of where that Venn diagram of success looks like and gives us that kind of starting point. So, from 3 to 4 to 5, right? 5 is the kind of the output of kind of seeing that Venn diagram, and then you can figure out what you're going to do first, second, third. But that prioritization happens in step 3, and then that mapping happens in step 4.
And if you plot those two, right? So if you hit the what's important to the client and what's available to us as our product and service, you will again create a magic quadrant in Gartner's perspective.
Which helps you prioritize, it's like, okay, everything in the top right corner, let's do that first.
Right. High priority, high value, or high capability, high value to the client.
And what's cool about this is that it's emergent, right? It's not like a group of people leaving the room and coming back and telling you. Everybody that's participating can now see it happen in front of them. So they know that like the only bias that's being filtered into this process is the bias of the people in the room. So that emergent kind of moment is very much an aha for everybody involved, because they're like, cool, it gets real clear, real fast.
And like one thing I want to just add before we move into the next section here is I want to anchor that down and like how powerful that moment of realization is for the group, for the future of the way they approach problem solving. Like the human brain, I mean, they talk about all the time training military units before they go overseas, right? And there's a reason why they put them in high stressful situations and put them into, kill houses, as they call them, to learn how to clear houses and get timing and all this other stuff, and put pressure so that when they go out into the field and they actually encounter pressure, the brain has already encountered pressure similar to it and is able to cope with it easier, right?
Yeah.
So when you get that person, even if it's just one time they experience that light bulb, they're forever going to understand that the only biases that are present are the ones that are in the room, and to get out of that thinking and escape kind of the box, go out into the unknown, into chaos, you can grab the different things that are out there and bring it back down into order. But until they go through that experience at least one time, they may not ever have that realization. But once that happens, it is valuable all the way across the span of the organization for the existence of that employee that experience that workshop.
It's really interesting, because a lot of people don't work this way. We're conditioned in like a capitalist kind of society that there's one person who does everything and the team is often obfuscated. Like it's called the great man theory of history, right? Where there's one founder or one visionary. And in all of these contexts that John and I have worked in, it's very much a team collaboration. There's no ownership assigned to the ideas that come out of this workshop. It's owned by the group, which is very collective. One of the things that we invite people to do in order to keep the space collaborative and inclusive is we invite people to ideate silently first, which kind of neutralizes the loudest voice in the room, because we're bringing in people that are kind of the intern as well as the executive, and we need them all to work together. So what are different things from a facilitation standpoint can we inject into this room to create a safe space, to allow people the safety to fail, to come up with that wild idea? We borrow some practice from improv, like yes and is something that we'll do a lot, where we don't discourage ideas that perhaps are unfeasible. We're like, yeah, let's play that out. Let's play that story. So that space, this space that you're socializing in, is very much a possibility space. It's a yes space. And so our role as facilitators is to create that level of comfort amongst the participants and facilitators to help them get there, right? That ideation phase, if you're thinking, if you're not feeling comfortable and confident, the ideas that people are gonna put out are not gonna be as creative as if they're in a great headspace. There's a study that Harvard University did on happiness in their happiness laboratory, and it was with physicians. And what they did was they had their control group, and it was a group of doctors, and then the test group was a group of doctors that got a piece of chocolate before they went and saw their patient. And so they baselined the doctors that didn't get the piece of chocolate in terms of their accuracy of diagnosis. Then they looked at the group that was given a piece of chocolate and looked at the accuracy of their diagnoses, and they saw like an exponentially better accuracy in the diagnoses that the doctors that were given a piece of chocolate before they saw the patient were than the control group. And what they realized is that when people are in a good place and feeling safe and confident and happy, their creativity increases exponentially. You're going to get a better outcome and a better output from them if that space is maintained and curated, the right dynamic. So the psychosocial piece of this, Jan, is very relevant. And it's not something that John and I really index on very much when we're talking about it from a business standpoint, but on a human-centered standpoint, and like, how do you get people to engage in this new way of working and not detract and participate? Very much happens in how you set these introductions up, how you set these activities up, and the space that you curate to invite people into this collaborative environment.
Oh yeah. And that's the spot that I'm like the most fascinated with right now is, okay, what types of activities bring people in? I was in an improv group in college, and it's super interesting the way that you kind of gamify that ideation process using improv, because games, we understand how to play games if we're properly socialized children at a very young age. It's basically, you're a 3, 4, 5-year-old, and you start the process off and you're just mimicking, right? And then there's this transition period, and it might be a little bit earlier than that. I'm sure somebody will comment on this to the stages, but you start out with like mimicking what the rules are, and you don't even really understand the rules. But as long as everybody agrees that the rules are the rules, you can run around in circles and have a great time, right? But then you get to this point where it's like, why are the rules the rules? You know, and but then when you gamify something, it takes people back to that childhood mentality where it's, hey, you know, as long as we all agree that this is, you know, what it is, and we respect that, you know, it automatically becomes a safe space because it's so deeply ingrained in how we operate as people. You know, that's how we learn to navigate the world at a really early age, is basically like, okay, I have empathy for this person because they're playing tag. If I break the rules, that means that I'm disrespecting them, and, you know, all of this other kind of stuff. But it kind of gives this parameter set within which to operate, which makes people comfortable. And then you just allow them to kind of continue a story and improv stuff. And holy, I can't even imagine the types of beautiful answers that come out of a structure like that. That's super, super interesting.
Well, you know, even play has rules, right? That's one of the reasons that play works, is because everyone follows this set of rules, and you've created these constraints, and those constraints aren't limiting, they're, you know, freeing in a lot of ways, because there's certain things you can't do, but working within those constraints often leads to, you know, stuff that you never expected.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap this segment up, or this piece up, and then last thing of this piece of this is, thanks, Nicholas, is we obviously we've started as sort of as at a convergent point. We've diverged, we've now converged, and we sort of now diverged again because we've got all these ideas and all these capabilities, and we've matched them up and we've prioritized them. Now, as an entrepreneur, and even as a customer, you can't implement everything at once, especially in something that's new and transformational that nobody's really ever done before. So we came up with this idea of developing this, what I call the agile-based roadmap, or the agile-based strategic plan, to help identify those value props. So the idea is all those things that are really important to the customer and match our immediate capability, so they end up in the top left-hand corner, right-hand corner, are what we want to focus on. So I love this concept in design thinking, and I think, Nicholas, if you'd expound upon this whole idea of developing the cake roadmap, right? The cupcake, the birthday cake, the wedding cake.
Yeah, absolutely, John. So a lot of times we'll hear the word MVP, you know, minimum viable product. And I think what this activity does is it reframes what the minimum viable product is, to think of it more as the minimum delightful experience, right? Because the minimum viable product is often driven by what's on the truck, what's feasible today. While the minimum delightful experience is what's the um, the smallest piece of value that we can deliver to the user right now, right? So when we talk about the kind of cake roadmap, right, what's that cupcake, right? If the big vision for the whole business is this, right, and that's the wedding cake, you know, the whole shebang, you know, it's a little fuzzy, you know, maybe we don't quite understand what this wedding cake looks like, you know, maybe we're not sure how many candles, how many layers, if it's sprinkles or fondant, you know, icing, we're not really sure, but we know we have kind of a general sense. But, you know, the famous, you know, how do you eat an elephant, you know, is one bite at a time. It's like, well, what's that minimum cupcake that still has that yummy taste of that wedding cake, but small enough and yummy enough that if we just give that to an end user, they'll be happy. They'll say, give me more. What's next? And so the activity of scoping your roadmap around this idea of what's the minimum delightful experience, what's the follow-on kind of experiences, allows you to scope that project in a way that that you're minimizing the collateral damage of a failed experiment, right? By keeping it small, you're delivering something delicious, but also minimizing, you know, the damage, the collateral damage. If that cupcake maybe isn't the right piece, maybe you know the mix isn't quite perfect, but you've at least scoped something that you can deliver. Ideally, it has the value that your user expects, but it's small enough that if it's not, you can make another cupcake really quickly.
Or change the frosting, or add more sugar, or you can pivot quickly.
Yeah.
And what we've learned so back to the entrepreneurial world, right? So you as an entrepreneur on a startup, you don't have time to build and sell the wedding cake. People don't even know if they want to get married yet, right? They don't even know if they want to date yet. So the idea of building cupcakes to help you. And so this what came up with this idea is this is how you come up with cupcakes, you go test them, and by doing this iteration of convergence, divergence, or divergence, convergence, divergence, convergence, right? We've converged on our cupcake. And now, if you go through this step, I would surmise that your odds of having good market fit have increased dramatically. And oh, by the way, it doesn't cost a lot to do this. In fact, in today's world, virtually, that's why the last picture on this slide is, Nicholas and I used to travel all over the world. We've been to Germany, we've been to London, I've been to South Africa, we've been to Hong Kong or Singapore doing these workshops and working with our clients through this process. And now we can do it all virtually. I mean, we had to because we were all, I haven't been on I traveled for business in over 18 months. So as we wrap this section up, the message is, by the way, we'll put a link or we'll give some capability if anybody's listening or watching wants this sort of 5-step process for market fit, better market fit. We're happy to share it. But that's sort of why I wanted to tie the experience that Nicholas has as a designer to the work that Jan and I are doing with entrepreneurs and startup. So that's that section.
And just to add to that, John, like when I think about what I would do if I was starting a business today, I figure out like what are 5 cupcakes that are kind of close to my wedding cake, that are kind of in the vein of my wedding cake, and find the cheapest way to figure out if people care about it. And that would be, standard process, a standard kind of practice. Like with each business I would launch is like, what are my 5 cupcakes each month until I kind of ooch my way to product market fit.
Yep. And that actually goes into the next